Somewhere in the Solomon Islands, late 1942, the tropical heat presses down like a weight, and the air is thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. A Japanese soldier crouches in the jungle undergrowth, his uniform torn and stained, his body weakened by weeks of reduced rations. He has been watching the enemy position for hours, gathering intelligence that might help his commanders plan the next attack. But what he sees now stops him cold. On the airfield that his comrades spent months building with shovels and bare hands, American machines are moving Earth at a pace that defies everything he has been taught about warfare. Massive yellow bulldozers, their engines roaring with mechanical power, push aside tons of coral and volcanic soil in minutes. Behind them, graders smooth the churned earth with precision. Trucks dump loads of crushed rock while other machines spread and compact it into a solid surface. Steel matting rolls out across the ground, interlocking panels that create a functional runway as he watches. What would have taken his engineering battalions 4 weeks of back-breaking labor, these Americans are accomplishing in hours, not days, hours. The soldier watches as a crater from last night's bombing, a hole that should have closed the field for a week, disappears beneath the blades of the bulldozers. By midday, aircraft will be taking off from the same spot where a 500-pound bomb had torn open the earth just 12 hours earlier. The soldier feels something shift inside his chest. It is not fear, exactly. He has faced death before and did not flinch. It is something worse. It is the first cold whisper of a question he cannot allow himself to fully form. What if everything he has been told about this war is wrong? This scene, or variations of it, played out across dozens of Pacific islands throughout the conflict. Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungle observed American construction capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions their entire military doctrine had been built upon. Japanese prisoners of war, held in camps where they were fed better than they had eaten as soldiers, learned production statistics that made their sacrifices seem not heroic but futile. They had been told that Americans were soft, materialistic, and spiritually weak. That Japanese warriors, fueled by the sacred fire of Yamato Damashi, would sweep aside these decadent Westerners like autumn leaves before a typhoon. Nobody had warned them about the bulldozers. To understand why a piece of construction equipment could shatter a soldier's worldview, you must first understand the mythology that Japanese military training had constructed around the coming war with America. This was not simple propaganda designed to boost morale. This was a comprehensive belief system that shaped everything from grand strategy to individual tactics, from resource allocation to the treatment of prisoners. In December 1941, as Imperial Japanese forces prepared to strike across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese Southern Army distributed a pamphlet to its soldiers. This 70-page document, titled "Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won," was written by Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most influential and controversial staff officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. Tsuji had helped plan the invasion of Malaya and would later participate in operations across the Pacific. His pamphlet was not unofficial opinion. It reflected mainstream Japanese military thinking about the nature of their Western enemies. Tsuji painted a portrait of the American and British soldier that bordered on contempt. "Our opponent," he wrote, meaning the Americans, "are even feebler than the Chinese army. Despite years of warfare in China, Japanese forces still dismissed their Chinese opponents. To be called weaker than them was the ultimate insult to American fighting capacity." Tsuji continued by describing Americans as very effeminate and very cowardly, possessing an intense dislike of fighting in the rain or the mist, and at night. American military equipment was dismissed as obsolete and inferior, posing no serious threat to modern Japanese forces. The message embedded throughout the pamphlet was clear and intoxicating. Japanese spiritual superiority would inevitably overwhelm Western material advantages. A samurai spirit and a sharp blade could defeat a merchant with a cash register, even if that merchant had a factory full of machines. The war would be won not through logistics or production, but through the superior fighting spirit of the Japanese soldier, his willingness to sacrifice everything, his absolute devotion to emperor and nation. This was not fringe thinking. This was official doctrine that shaped military planning at the highest levels of the Japanese government and armed forces. The concept of seishin, which translates roughly as fighting spirit or spiritual power, had been formally promoted throughout the Japanese military establishment since General Baron Sadao Araki served as war minister in 1932. His spiritual training program, known as Seishin Kyoiku, emphasized Bushido-inspired loyalty to the emperor, moral purity, and the supremacy of human spirit over technological materiel. This philosophy had profound practical consequences. It actively discouraged investment in mechanized warfare, in logistics infrastructure, in the unglamorous but essential business of keeping soldiers supplied with food, ammunition, medical care, and equipment. Why invest in trucks when Japanese soldiers could carry supplies on their backs, sustained by their superior spirit? Why build mechanical advantage when willpower would suffice? The doctrine of Seishin made logistics seem almost cowardly, a Western obsession that revealed spiritual weakness rather than practical wisdom. The related concept of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, became the official rallying cry for the armed forces. Scholar Roy Andrew Miller documented how this ancient phrase was transformed during the 1930s and 40s into a militant ideology. The assumption was that the unique spiritual qualities of the Japanese people, qualities that no foreigner could possess or understand, would compensate for any material disadvantage. Japan might have fewer ships and fewer aircraft and fewer factories, but Japan had Yamato Damashii, and spirit would triumph over steel. The Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code issued on January 8, 1941 in War Minister Tojo's name, codified the ultimate expression of this spiritual doctrine in relation to combat behavior. The most famous and most consequential passage declared that a soldier must never live to experience shame as a prisoner. Death before surrender, honor above survival. These were not suggestions or guidelines. They were sacred commandments issued in the name of the emperor himself. The psychological effect of this code was profound and devastating. It transformed surrender from a tactical decision, which every Western military acknowledged as sometimes necessary, into an unforgivable moral catastrophe. A soldier who surrendered brought eternal shame upon himself, his family, his ancestors, and his descendants. Death in battle, no matter how pointless, was infinitely preferable to the disgrace of capture. This doctrine would send hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers to their deaths in hopeless situations where any Western force would have surrendered to fight another day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood what his government and his fellow officers did not. As commander of the combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Yamamoto was perhaps the most strategically important figure in the Japanese military. He was also one of the few senior leaders who had actually seen America with his own eyes. He had studied at Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had traveled across the United States, visiting factories and shipyards and observing the vast industrial capacity that most Japanese leaders knew only as abstractions on paper. In 1940, when Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe asked Yamamoto about the prospects of a war with the United States, the admiral delivered a warning that would prove tragically prophetic. "If we are ordered to do it," Yamamoto said, "then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." The admiral understood something that the Seishin doctrine obscured. War is ultimately a contest of production capacity. The nation that can build more ships, more aircraft, more weapons, more supplies, and replace its losses faster than its enemy will eventually win. Spirit alone cannot sink an aircraft carrier or resupply a starving garrison. After Pearl Harbor, while his staff officers celebrated what appeared to be one of the most stunning military victories in history, Yamamoto reportedly spent the day in apparent depression. Rather than joining the festivities, he remained somber and withdrawn. He later reflected on the attack with words that revealed his true feelings. "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy," he said. "It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten." The admiral who had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor understood something his celebrating junior officers did not. They had not won the war. They had merely started a clock that was already ticking toward Japan's destruction. The numbers that would ultimately seal Japan's fate existed before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. They were available to anyone willing to look at them honestly, without the distorting lens of Seishin ideology. Japan's total war-making potential represented approximately 3.5% of the world total. America's represented 41.5%. Before a single bullet had been fired or a single ship had been sunk, Japan was attempting to fight an enemy nearly 12 times more powerful in raw industrial terms. By 1945, American GDP would reach approximately $1.474 trillion, measured in 1990 international dollar equivalents. Japan's GDP at the same point was $144 billion. The ratio was more than 10 to 1. The United States alone accounted for over 50% of total global GNP during the war years. Japan was not fighting one enemy among equals. Japan was fighting the most productive economy in human history. The specific material gaps were even more devastating when examined in detail. America produced 13 times as much steel as Japan. Steel was the fundamental material of modern warfare, needed for ships, tanks, aircraft, weapons, ammunition, construction equipment, and 1,000 other military necessities. 11 times as much coal, the fuel that powered industry, and most critically, 222 times as much oil. Oil powered the ships of the combined fleet. Oil powered the aircraft of the Imperial Navy and Army. Without oil, Japan's military was immobile, and Japan had to import virtually all of its oil, much of it from the United States itself, until the embargo of 1941. Japan's entire industrial capacity was equivalent to only 10% of America's. This meant that even if Japanese factories operated at maximum efficiency with zero waste, while American factories operated at minimum efficiency with maximum waste, America would still outproduce Japan by a factor of 5 or more. The mathematics were inexorable. Spirit cannot manufacture aircraft engines. Willpower cannot smelt steel. Yamato Damashi cannot drill for oil. But nowhere was the contrast between Japanese and American capability more visible, more immediate, and more psychologically devastating to Japanese soldiers than in construction. Before the war, Japanese military engineering relied almost exclusively on manual labor. Thousands of soldiers and conscripted civilian workers would dig with shovels and pickaxes, haul earth in baskets carried on poles across their shoulders, level ground with hand tools, compact surfaces by pounding with wooden implements. It was backbreaking, exhausting work that required enormous manpower and took weeks or months to complete even a basic airfield. When Japanese engineers began constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands during the summer of 1942, they followed traditional methods. They deployed 2,524 construction laborers, plus 250 civilians, over 2,700 men in total. Working under the tropical sun, they carved a runway out of the jungle using hand tools and human muscle. The work required approximately 1 month to complete the runway that would soon become the most bitterly contested piece of real estate in the Pacific War. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the United States Navy had recognized a fundamentally different truth about modern warfare. Victory required the ability to build bases quickly, under fire, in hostile territory thousands of miles from the home front. On January 5, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Ben Moriel established the Naval Construction Battalions. The men who would join these units became known as Seabees, a phonetic spelling of the initials CB. Their motto would become Construimus, Batuimus. We build, we fight. The Seabees were not ordinary sailors learning construction skills. They were skilled construction workers, experienced tradesmen who had built bridges and highways and skyscrapers and dams in their civilian careers, now bringing those skills to the military. The Navy actively recruited carpenters, electricians, plumbers, steelworkers, heavy equipment operators, surveyors, and dozens of other specialized trades. The average age of a Seabee was 37 years old, far older than the typical combat soldier or sailor. These were seasoned professionals who knew their craft, and they brought their equipment with them. The arsenal of American construction machinery deployed to the Pacific would have seemed like science fiction to the Japanese engineers digging with shovels on Guadalcanal. Bulldozers capable of moving cubic yards of earth in minutes, motor graders that could level a surface to precise specifications, cranes that could lift tons of material, dump trucks that could haul loads that would require dozens of men with baskets, rock crushers that could produce gravel on site, concrete mixers, pile drivers, air compressors, welding equipment, the entire infrastructure of American industrial might packaged and shipped to remote Pacific islands. By the end of World War II, more than 325,000 men would serve in the Seabees. They would build 111 major airstrips across the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. They would construct 441 piers to handle the enormous volume of shipping that sustained American operations. They would build hospitals capable of treating 70,000 patients simultaneously. They would create storage facilities for 100 million gallons of aviation gasoline. They accomplished these feats while fighting alongside combat troops, often under enemy fire, sometimes taking up rifles to defend their construction sites. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they captured the partially completed Japanese airfield within hours. The Japanese engineers, who had spent weeks building it, fled into the jungle, abandoning their tools and equipment. American forces immediately set about completing and improving the runway. Within 2 weeks, the first aircraft were operating from what the Americans named Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator, killed during the Battle of Midway. Henderson Field became the pivot point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese commanders understood that as long as American aircraft could operate from Henderson Field, they could interdict Japanese shipping throughout the Solomon Islands. Destroyers and transports attempting to reinforce or supply Japanese troops on Guadalcanal would be attacked by aircraft operating from the very island they were trying to capture. Taking or neutralizing Henderson Field became Japan's strategic obsession. The first Seabees arrived on Guadalcanal in September 1942. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion found themselves in an active combat zone, building and fighting simultaneously, often on the same day. Their immediate priority was extending the runway to accommodate larger aircraft. They cleared and graded an additional 1,300 feet of runway length. They surfaced it with mast and mat, interlocking pierced steel planking that could create a functional runway surface in days rather than weeks. The steel panels could be laid quickly, drained water effectively, and could be repaired or replaced with relative ease. Japanese forces threw everything they had at Henderson Field: naval bombardments, air raids, artillery, infantry assaults. On the night of October 13th and 14th, 1942, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, sailed into Iron Bottom Sound and unleashed a devastating bombardment. Nearly 1,000 14-inch shells tore into Henderson Field, cratering the runway, destroying dozens of aircraft, igniting fuel dumps, killing dozens of American personnel. It was the most destructive naval bombardment American forces would suffer in the entire Pacific War. Japanese commanders believed they had finally neutralized the airfield that had been the key to American resistance on Guadalcanal. The Seabees had different plans. Working through the night and into the following day under sporadic air attack, their crater crews filled bomb holes, cleared debris, patched damaged runway surfaces, and restored operations. The techniques they developed were remarkably efficient. A specialized crew could repair a crater from a 500-pound bomb in approximately 40 minutes. Larger craters took longer but were still repaired in hours rather than days. By the afternoon following the devastating battleship bombardment, aircraft were again taking off from Henderson Field to attack Japanese shipping. This pattern repeated throughout the Guadalcanal campaign and across the Pacific as the war progressed. No matter how many times Japanese bombs and shells damaged American airfields, the Seabees rebuilt them. Japanese pilots returning from missions would report that they had cratered the enemy runway that aircraft would be unable to operate for days. Then they would encounter American fighters launched from that same runway hours later. The psychological effect on Japanese air crews and commanders was profound. They were fighting an enemy that simply could not be stopped, an enemy that could repair damage faster than Japan could inflict it. The speed records accelerated as the war progressed, and Seabee techniques were refined through experience. On Saipan in 1944, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion had the captured Japanese airfield at Aslito operational within 4 days of its seizure. 4 days to repair war damage, extend runways, install equipment, and begin flight operations. Japanese engineers would have required weeks or months for the same task. On Tinian Island, approximately 3 miles from Saipan, 15,000 Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Brigade undertook one of the largest construction projects of the war. They built 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long, capable of handling the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers that would eventually attack the Japanese home islands. None of these runways required more than 53 days to complete from start to finish. The Seabees moved 11 million cubic yards of earth and coral in the process. When completed, Northfield on Tinian became the largest airport in the world, capable of launching 450 B-29 bombers in 70 to 80 minutes. On Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, the first airfield was ready for operations just 7 days after the initial Marine landing, while intense combat still raged across much of the island. On Okinawa, 4 days. American construction capability had become a weapon of war as devastating in its way as any bomb or torpedo. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to mechanize its construction capability at all. The Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned Komatsu to develop bulldozers in December 1942, nearly a year after Pearl Harbor. The first units rolled off the production line in 1943. Japanese engineers had finally recognized that manual labor could not compete with American machinery. But recognition came too late, and production capacity was inadequate to the need. By the end of the war, Komatsu had produced only 148 bulldozers for military use, and even this small number was largely ineffective because most units shipped to Pacific Islands were attacked and sunk before reaching their destinations. American submarines and aircraft were strangling Japanese supply lines so effectively that even the few bulldozers Japan managed to produce could not reach the troops who needed them. The United States, by contrast, deployed over 100,000 tractors and bulldozers during the war. The ratio was roughly 700 to 1. This single statistic encapsulates why Japan could not win a prolonged war against America. 700 American bulldozers for every Japanese bulldozer. 700 times the construction capacity. 700 times the ability to build, repair, and sustain military operations. Major General Eugene Raybould, head of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, declared in 1944 that American construction capacity was the one factor of American strength which our enemies most consistently underestimated. General Raybould was correct. Japanese military planners had built their entire strategy around the assumption that spiritual power would compensate for material weakness. They had studied American industry in abstract terms, but they had not grasped what it would mean in practice. Watching American bulldozers reshape Pacific Islands at will was the physical refutation of everything they had been taught to believe. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki embodied the Japanese military's absolute faith in spirit over Pano. Materiel. A career infantry officer, Ichiki had internalized the Seishin doctrine completely. Before the Battle of the Tenaru River in August 1942, Ichiki had referred to United States Marines as effeminate and cowardly, echoing the language of Colonel Tsuji's pamphlet. He reportedly scoffed that it only required swords and sabers to defeat the Americans. His contempt for his enemy was total and unshakable, the product of years of indoctrination in the doctrine of Japanese spiritual superiority. Ichiki landed on Guadalcanal with 917 men of his detachment on the night of August 18th to 19th, 1942. His mission was to retake Henderson Field and drive the Americans from the island. His force was actually the first echelon of a larger planned reinforcement, but Ichiki decided not to wait for additional troops. His confidence in his soldiers and in his own leadership was absolute. 917 Japanese soldiers animated by true fighting spirit would sweep aside whatever American forces stood in their way. Ichiki did not conduct proper reconnaissance of American positions. He did not probe for weaknesses or develop a detailed tactical plan. Instead, he ordered a direct frontal assault across the sandbar at the mouth of the Tenaru River, which American forces had fortified as part of their perimeter defense around Henderson Field. The attack began in the early hours of August 21, 1942. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division were waiting. Machine gun positions that had been carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire opened up on the Japanese assault. Riflemen with their M1 Garand and BAR automatic rifles added their volume to the defensive fusillade. Artillery registered on likely approach routes began dropping shells with devastating accuracy. Ichiki's men charged directly into this wall of fire, wave after wave falling on the sandbar, their battle cries drowned by the thunder of American weapons. When dawn broke, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell led Marine M3 Stuart light tanks across the Tenarue River to counterattack surviving Japanese soldiers who had taken refuge in a coconut grove. The tanks systematically destroyed the remaining Japanese resistance, crushing wounded soldiers under their treads as they ground through the grove. The battle became a massacre. Of the 917 men Colonel Ichiki had landed with, approximately 800 were killed in the battle and its immediate aftermath. Japanese dead carpeted the sandbar and floated in the waters of the Tenarue. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and 75 wounded. The exchange ratio was more than 20-1 in favor of the American defenders. When reports of the battle reached Japanese headquarters, one general reportedly responded with the words, "I think it is a false report." The result was so catastrophic, so completely contrary to everything Japanese doctrine predicted about combat with decadent American forces, that senior officers literally could not accept it as real. 900 Japanese soldiers, led by an experienced colonel, attacking with pure fighting spirit, had been annihilated by American Marines in a single night. This was not supposed to be possible according to everything the doctrine of Seishin promised. Colonel Ichiki himself survived the initial battle. According to various accounts, he burned his regimental colours to prevent their capture, an act of profound military significance. He then reportedly took his own life, though some sources suggest he may have been killed attempting to escape. Either way, his absolute confidence in Japanese spiritual superiority, his contempt for American fighting capability, had led nearly 900 of his men to pointless deaths against an enemy he had dismissed as too soft to fight. The Tenarue was only the beginning. Japanese reinforcements continued to arrive on Guadalcanal through September and October 1942, and each attempted assault on Henderson Field met the same fate, the Battle of Edson's Ridge in September. The Battle of Henderson Field in October. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died in frontal assaults against prepared American positions, their spirit no match for American firepower, logistics, and defensive engineering. The failures extended far beyond Guadalcanal. Across the Pacific Theater, Japanese military logistics collapsed completely as the war progressed, revealing the fatal consequences of a doctrine that considered supply lines spiritually insignificant. The statistics are almost incomprehensible in their scale of human suffering. Of Japan's 2.3 million total military deaths during World War II, approximately 1.4 million, 60%, died from starvation, malnutrition, or diseases caused by nutritional immunodeficiency, not from enemy bullets, not from bombs or shells, from hunger. Japanese soldiers died because their military culture considered logistics beneath the warrior's dignity, because their commanders prioritized spiritual preparation over food and ammunition and medical supplies. On Guadalcanal itself, the numbers tell the story of catastrophe. Approximately 15,000 of the 25,000 Japanese soldiers who died on the island perished from starvation, not combat. The troops who survived began calling Guadalcanal by a bitter new name, Starvation Island. The Japanese characters for Guadalcanal could be pronounced to sound like the word for hunger. It became a grim joke among the starving soldiers holding positions in the jungle, while American forces controlled the sea approaches that might have brought them food. In New Guinea, the situation was even worse. 97% of Japanese deaths on that island were from non-combat causes, primarily starvation and tropical disease. Soldiers' daily rice rations, which were supposed to be 300 grams, fell to as low as 30 to 60 grams. Men could literally count the individual grains of rice in their meals. Survivors described eating anything they could find to stay alive: lizards, frogs, snakes, mice, the hearts of palm trees. Sprouting leaves boiled into thin gruel that provided almost no nutrition. Documented evidence exists of cannibalism on some Pacific islands. Japanese soldiers consuming the flesh of dead comrades or enemy prisoners to avoid starvation. The retreat from Imphal in Burma during 1944 became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in Japanese history. Of approximately 85,000 Japanese troops who crossed the Chindwin River for the invasion of India, the casualty rate reached over 70%. The overwhelming majority of these casualties were from starvation, disease, and exhaustion, rather than British or Indian combat action. Nearly all of the 12,000 horses and mules that accompanied the expedition perished. The retreat route became known as the White Bones Road, because of the Japanese corpses lining it at every step. Foreign Office official Kase Toshikazu called Imphal perhaps the worst disaster of its kind yet chronicled in the annals of war. Vice Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded what the Americans called the Tokyo Express, the desperate destroyer runs that attempted to resupply Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. His testimony, published in a two-part series in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in July and August 1956, provides a first-hand Japanese perspective on the logistics catastrophe and the dawning recognition of defeat. There is no question that Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal. Tanaka wrote with the benefit of hindsight. He described watching American forces repair or replace damaged ships with speed which astonished us, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace their losses. An auxiliary airfield was prepared in an amazingly short time, he noted about American construction capability, and the enemy's air strength could then be greatly increased. Tanaka understood what he was seeing. American logistics and construction capacity were defeating Japan as surely as American guns and bombs. The Tokyo Express itself illustrated the futility of Japanese logistics against American dominance. Unable to risk slow cargo ships within range of Henderson Field's aircraft, Japanese commanders resorted to using fleet destroyers as supply vessels. The destroyers would race down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, at night, hoping to avoid American air attack. They could not risk the time required to actually dock and unload cargo. Instead, they would roll sealed steel drums overboard near shore, hoping that Japanese troops could swim out and retrieve them. The recovery rates were catastrophic. A typical December 1942 supply run saw 1,500 drums dropped into the water. Japanese forces recovered only 300. 80% of the supplies, desperately needed by starving soldiers, sank to the bottom of the sea or drifted away on ocean currents. And even successful runs delivered only a fraction of what the garrison needed to sustain combat operations. A cargo ship was approximately 30 times more efficient per unit of fuel consumed than a destroyer. But cargo ships could not survive within range of American aircraft operating from Henderson Field. This systemic logistics failure was not an accident or bad luck. It was the direct and predictable consequence of a military doctrine that devalued material concerns in favor of spiritual preparation. After the disastrous border conflict with the Soviet Union at Nomonhan in 1939, the Imperial Japanese Army's after-action reports candidly acknowledged failure to pay attention to intelligence, poor logistics, and the need for better tanks and weapons. Japanese forces had been badly mauled by Soviet armor and artillery superiority. Historian Edward Dreher documented what happened next. Rather than investing in material improvements based on the hard lessons of Nomonhan, Japanese military leadership concluded that they needed to enhance their spiritual power. The answer to Soviet tanks was not better Japanese tanks. The answer was more seishin, more fighting spirit. This institutional refusal to learn from failure would cost over 1 million Japanese lives. Japanese military culture assigned, revealing nomenclature to its conscripted soldiers. They were called Isen Gorin, which translates as 1 sen 5 rin, the cost of the postcard that summoned them to military service. 1 sen 5 rin was roughly equivalent to a penny in American money. Men worth a penny required no expensive logistics infrastructure. They could march on empty stomachs, sustained by their fighting spirit. They could attack enemy positions without adequate ammunition, making up in courage what they lacked in bullets. This calculation would prove catastrophically wrong, but by the time its falsity became undeniable, over 1 million Japanese soldiers had already starved to death on Pacific Islands and Asian battlefields. When Japanese soldiers became prisoners of war, they entered a world that contradicted everything their training and indoctrination had led them to expect. A June 1945 report by the Office of War Information found that 84% of Japanese prisoners expected torture and death upon capture. The Senjinkan had taught them that surrender was not merely shameful but suicidal. They had been told that Americans were savages who would mutilate, torture, and eventually murder any Japanese soldier who fell into their hands. Many soldiers had been instructed to kill themselves rather than risk the horrors that awaited prisoners. Instead of torture chambers, Japanese prisoners found adequate food, medical care, and surprisingly humane treatment. They received medical and dental care that was essentially identical to what American troops received. Many prisoners were fed better as captives than they had eaten as soldiers in their own army, certainly better than the starving garrisons they had left behind on Guadalcanal or New Guinea. They had access to post-exchange items, including American chocolate bars, and even beer for 10 cents. The contrast between expectation and reality was so dramatic, so completely at odds with everything Japanese soldiers had been taught to believe, that many prisoners initially suspected elaborate psychological warfare. Surely this kindness was some kind of sophisticated trick designed to extract intelligence before the torture finally began. Some prisoners waited weeks or months for the other shoe to drop, for the Americans to reveal their true savage nature. It never happened. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki became the first Japanese prisoner of World War II when his midget submarine malfunctioned during the Pearl Harbor attack. The two-man submarine he commanded developed gyro compass problems and ran aground near Bellows Field on Oahu. Sakamaki's crewmate drowned in the surf, but Sakamaki himself washed ashore at Waimanalo Beach on December 8, 1941, where he was captured by an American soldier. Sakamaki's initial response reflected his training perfectly. He asked his captors for permission to commit suicide, which was, of course, denied. He burned himself with cigarettes, inflicting pain on his own body as partial atonement for the unbearable shame of having survived and surrendered. According to Japanese doctrine, he should have died with his submarine. His continued existence was a moral catastrophe that could never be fully remediated. But over time, Sakamaki's perspective shifted. He found that he was treated with fairness and even kindness by his American captors. The food was adequate. The guards were professional. Nobody tortured him for information or humiliated him for propaganda purposes. The contrast with everything he had been taught about the savage Americans was total. After the war, Sakamaki wrote a memoir about his experiences and publicly challenged Japan's prisoner death shame culture. He argued that surrender was not moral failure, that the doctrine that killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers in hopeless situations had been wrong from the beginning. He became a successful businessman and eventually rose to become an executive at Toyota Motor Corporation, living proof that surrender did not mean the end of honor, usefulness, or the possibility of a meaningful life. A captured Japanese prisoner statement preserved in the Sandberg-Holmgren propaganda collection at the University of Nebraska captures the pattern of shattered illusions. The officers said they knew that Japan is losing the war and that defeat is inevitable, the prisoner reported about conversations in his unit. The enlisted men, on the other hand, had been told that Japan was winning. When they realized, however, that their Navy and Air Force could not aid them, they finally knew the truth. They realized that American industrial might was too great to be opposed by inadequate forces poorly equipped and supplied. The psychological transformation that some prisoners experienced could be total and profound. One documented prisoner articulated his experience in striking terms. He said he had died as a Japanese soldier, that his old self animated by Seishin and Yamato Damashi had perished when he surrendered, and that all prisoners of war have been reborn. Some prisoner groups went so far as to express willingness to fight alongside Allied soldiers against Japan. On Saipan alone, over 2,174 Japanese soldiers surrendered, an extraordinary number given the absolute prohibition on surrender that had been drilled into every soldier. The production statistics that these prisoners came to understand were devastating to any hope that Japan might somehow win the war. In 1944 alone, the United States built 96,318 military aircraft. This single year of American production exceeded Japan's total output during the entire war, which amounted to approximately 76,000 aircraft. America built more planes in 12 months than Japan managed in 4 years of maximum war effort. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan illustrated American industrial capability at its most impressive. At peak production, Willow Run produced one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Each of these aircraft contained 1.55 million individual parts. The assembly line ran nearly a mile long. The facility employed over 42,000 workers at its height. And Willow Run was just one of many American aircraft factories operating around the clock. Liberty ships, the unglamorous cargo vessels that sustained Allied logistics across both oceans, came to symbolize American production capability. 18 shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships during the war, using revolutionary prefabrication and welding techniques. By 1943, the average construction time had fallen to 42 days per ship. The record holder was the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California, in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A complete ocean-going cargo ship, built from keel to launch in less than 5 days. The United States built 141 aircraft carriers during the war. Japan built 17. By 1945, the United States Navy was larger than every other navy in the world combined, including all Allied navies added together. America produced approximately 86,000 tanks versus Japan's roughly 6,500. 2 million military trucks versus Japan's estimated 165,000 to 180,000. 40 times as many artillery shells. And the most devastating statistic of all was this: only about 25 to 30% of American resources were dedicated to the Pacific Theater. The majority was focused on defeating Nazi Germany in Europe and the Atlantic. Japan was not fighting America's full strength. Japan was not even fighting half of America's strength. Japan was fighting America's secondary effort, and that fraction alone was sufficient to overwhelm the combined fleet, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the entire war-making capacity of the Japanese Empire. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, established in November 1944, sent teams to Japan after the surrender to interrogate officials and examine evidence. The survey's investigators interviewed over 700 Japanese military officers, government bureaucrats, and industrial leaders. Their conclusion, based on Japanese officials' own testimony, was unambiguous. Japan's economic potential could support a short war or a war of limited liabilities, the survey reported. When the initial blow failed to result in peace, Japan, without significant help from Germany, was doomed. Its economy could not support a protracted campaign against an enemy even half as strong as the United States. The survey noted that Japan was fighting an enemy not half as strong but 12 times stronger in raw industrial capacity. After the war, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, the author of Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won, reluctantly acknowledged the delusion that had shaped Japanese military thinking. The Japanese error during the war was its belief that because the Anglo-Saxons were merchant nations, they would not carry on a protracted war, Tsuji admitted. American and British binding and determined spirit turned out to be as tough as Japan's. The colonel, who had dismissed Americans as effeminate and cowardly, lived to see Japan's total defeat. He spent years after the war evading war crimes charges related to his activities in Southeast Asia. He eventually entered politics, served in the Japanese Diet, and then disappeared mysteriously in Laos in 1961. His fate remains unknown. The story of Japanese soldiers watching American bulldozers is ultimately not about any single individual. It is the story of an entire military doctrine colliding with industrial reality. It is the story of a nation that bet everything on the supremacy of human will and discovered that will alone cannot move mountains. Machines can move mountains. And America had the machines. More Japanese soldiers died from hunger than from enemy fire during the war. They starved on islands surrounded by fish-filled oceans because their military culture considered logistics beneath the warrior's dignity. They died believing that spirit would somehow substitute for food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcement. They were betrayed by a doctrine that promised victory through willpower and delivered only mass death. Meanwhile, American Seabees built and rebuilt Henderson Field so many times that it became a symbol of everything Japan could not overcome. Not American courage, though courage was abundant. Not American skill, though skill was evident everywhere. But American capacity, the ability to produce more, repair faster, sustain longer, and simply keep going until the enemy exhausted himself against the inexhaustible wall of American industrial might. That is the meaning of a Japanese soldier's tears upon watching American bulldozers at work. Those tears were not weakness, they were recognition. The sudden, devastating recognition that everything he had been taught was wrong. That spirit does not conquer steel. That courage does not outweigh logistics. That a nation capable of building an airfield in 4 days will inevitably defeat a nation that requires a month of hand labor for the same task. The tears marked the death of an illusion that had sustained him through years of brutal training and months of desperate combat. The Seabees continued to serve after World War II, carrying their hard-won expertise into Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts around the world. Their descendants still serve today in the United States Navy, maintaining the tradition established by Rear Admiral Ben Moriel in January 1942. The heavy equipment has evolved from the bulldozers and graders of the Pacific War to sophisticated modern engineering vehicles, but the fundamental capability remains unchanged. The ability to project construction power anywhere in the world, to build bases and airfields and infrastructure under fire, to reshape the battlefield itself faster than any enemy can respond. Japan took a different lesson from the war. The nation that had dismissed industrial capacity as spiritually inferior to samurai virtue transformed itself in the decades after 1945 into one of the world's greatest industrial powers. Companies like Toyota, where former prisoner of war Kazuo Sakamaki eventually worked, pioneered manufacturing techniques that would revolutionize global industry. Japanese construction firms became world leaders in efficiency and quality. The lesson written in blood was not forgotten. Spirit matters, but so do machines. Courage matters, but so does logistics. Willpower matters, but so does production capacity. Some lessons require catastrophe before they can be truly learned. Japan learned that logistics wins wars. American bulldozers provided the classroom. The tuition was paid in the lives of over 2 million Japanese servicemen who deserved better leadership than the Seishin Doctrine could ever provide. Their sacrifice was real. Their courage was genuine. But they were sent to fight a war that mathematics had already decided, armed with a doctrine that promised victory through willpower and delivered only unmarked graves on forgotten Pacific islands.